Continuing to read the characteristics of mysticism, such symbolism as this. A living symbolism of experience and action, as well as of a statement, sometimes almost essential to mystical expression. The mind must employ some device of the kind of its transcendental perceptions, wholly unrelated as they are to the phenomenon with which intellect is able to deal, as ever to be grasped by the surface consciousness. Sometimes the symbol and the perception which it represents become fused in that consciousness, and the mystic's experience then represents himself to him as visions or voices, which we must look upon as the garment he has himself provided to veil that reality, upon which no man may look and live. The nature of this garment would be largely conditioned by his temperament, as in Rawls' evidence. Bias takes towards music. Rawls' evident bias towards music. Saint Catherine of Genoa's leaning towards the abstract conceptions of fire and light. Also by his theological education and environment. Cases in point are the highly dogmatic visions. What?
Abstract conceptions of fire and light.
Yeah.
I have to find about that.
Dogmatic visions and auditions of Saint Gertrude, Suso, Saint Catherine of Siena, the Blessed Angela of Foligno, above all, of Saint Teresa, whose marvelous self-analysis provide the classic account of these attempts of the mind to translate transcendental intuitions into concepts with which it can deal. The greatest mystics, however, Ruysbrock, St. John of the Cross, and St. Teresa herself, in her later stages, distinguish clearly between the ineffable.
Mother Teresa they're talking about?
No, St. Teresa of Avila. She's from way back.
You've been reading that.
Yeah, we read the Interior Castle.
Mm-hmm.
We already have extensive erudition into St. Teresa. We read the Interior Castle. Distinguish clearly between the ineffable reality which they perceive and the image under which they describe it. Again and again they tell us with Dionysius and Eckhart. Eckhart is a good mystic, that the object of their contemplation, quote, hath no image, unquote. Or with St. John of the Cross, that, quote, the soul can never attain to the height of the divine union so far as it is possible in this life, through the medium of any forms or figures. Therefore, the attempt which has sometimes been made to identify mysticism with such forms and figures, with visions, voices, supernatural flavors, and the other abnormal phenomenon, is clearly wrong. We're just talking of formless God. Nirguna, the highest and most divine things which it is given us to see and to know, says Dionysius the Areopagite plainly, quote, are but the symbolic language of things subordinate to him who himself transcended them all, through which things his incomparable presence is shown, walking on those heights of his holy places which are perceived by the mind. The mystic, as a rule, cannot wholly do without symbol and image, inadequate to his vision, though they must always be. For his experience must be expressed as it is to be communicated, and its actuality is inexpressible except in some sidelong way. He might have to write poetry there. Is that like the sidelong way? Would you say?
Read it again.
The mystic, as a rule, cannot wholly do without symbol and image, inadequate to his vision, though they must always be, for his experience must be expressed, if it is to be communicated, and its actuality is inexpressible in some poetic sidelong way, some hint or parallel which would stimulate the dormant intuition of the reader and convey, as all poetic language does, something beyond its surface sense, hence the large part which is played in all mystical writings by symbolism and imagery, and also by that rhythmic and exalted language which induces in sensitive persons something of the languid ecstasy of dream. The close connection between the rhythm and heightened states of consciousness is as yet little understood. Its further investigation will probably throw much light on ontological as well as psychological problems. Mystical, no less than musical, poetic perception tends naturally, we know not why, to present itself in rhythmical periods, a feature which is also strongly marked in writings obtained in the automatic state. So constant is this law in some subjects that Baron van Hugel adopted the presence or absence of rhythm as a test whereby to distinguish the genuine utterances of Saint Catherine of Genoa. He's saying that the presence of rhythm was a sign that it was her writing, from those wrongly attributed to her by successive editors of her legend. He used linguistic analysis of rhythm. He used quantitative linguistics. Of all kinds of symbolic language come naturally to the articulate mystic. Are you articulate mystic at all? Do you write in your poetry and published it? Who is often a literary artist as well, so naturally that he sometimes forgets to explain that his utterance is but symbolic, despite attempt to translate the truth of that world, into the beauty of this. It is here that mysticism joins hands with music and poetry. Had this fact always been recognized by his critics, they would have been saved from many regrettable and some ludicrous misconceptions. Symbol, the cloth, which the spiritual borrows from the material plane, is a form of artistic expression. That is to say, it is not literal, but suggestive. Though the artist who uses it may sometimes lose sight of this distinction. Hence the persons who imagine that the, quote, spiritual marriage of Saint Catherine of Teresa veils a perverted sexuality, that the vision of the Sacred Heart involved an incredible anatomical experience, or that the divine inebriation of the Sufis is the apotheosis of drunkenness. Do you think that Sufis, were just drinking wine, or was it abstract spiritual wine?
Symbolic.
Was it symbolic, or did they just drink a lot? Do but advertise the ignorance of the mechanism of the arts, like the lady who thought that Blake must be mad. I think Blake was mad. Be mad because he said that he had touched the sky with his finger. Blake touched the sky with his finger.
If you do that, this is
He's crazy, dear.
No,
And Rumi was a drunk.
There is sky.
What?
There is sky.
They just drank wine. He was crazy. Or else it's just symbolism.
Or maybe he flew away in his meditation, so he did touch the sky.
He actually did it. So I'm saying it's not spirit symbolism, it's actual. Further the study of the mystics, the keeping company, however humbly, with their minds, brings with it as music or poetry does, but in a far greater degree the strange exhilaration, as if we were brought near to some mighty source of being. We're at last on the verge of the secret which all seek. The symbols displayed, the actual words employed, when we analyze them, are not enough to account for such effect. It is rarely that these messages from the waking transcendental self of another stir our own deeper selves in their sleep. It were hardly an extravagance to say that those writings which are the outcome of true and first-hand mystical experience may be known by their power of imparting to the reader the sense of exalted and extended life. Quote, all mystics, unquote, says Saint Martin, quote, speak the same language, for they come from the same country. Famous quote. Who said it? Who said all mystics?
Say what you said.
All mystics speak the same language, for they come from the same country.
They speak of the...
Quote who?
The tongueless language.
Who said it? Saint Martin. Who is he? Who's Saint Martin?
Martin, the French.
French? The deep undying life within us came from that country too, and it recognizes the accents of home, though it cannot always understand what they would say. We have to stop here. We had read about the characteristics of mysticism, and we found out that Blake may have been crazy and Rumi was drunk, or else they used symbols, or else they actually experienced it. So, we were reading from Mysticism by Evelyn Underhill.